he's perfectionist, as almost everyone we've discussed would fall into that personality characteristic. They're a perfectionist. But I mean, on a more provable level. I mean, you know, it's different.
For decades, Jack Nicholson reigned as Hollywood's most unpredictable force. A mad genius with a wicked smile, a legendary temper, and a filmography that defined generations. He was the rebel in Easy Rider, the maniac in The Shining, the devil in The Witches of Eastwick, and the truth-teller in A Few Good Men. But while his on-screen performances were electric, his off-screen relationships were far more volatile. Behind that iconic grin was a man who didn't suffer fools, didn't tolerate disrespect, and never forgot a slight. Nicholson, now 88 and long retired from the public eye, has finally started speaking, quietly, selectively, about the people who crossed him, the actors who brought friction to his sets, and the egos he couldn't stand to share space with. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. Because when Jack talks, Hollywood still listens. Some of these names may shock you. They were once friends, co-stars, even collaborators. But over time, they became enemies in Jack's memory, men he simply couldn't trust, or worse, couldn't respect. In an industry built on fake smiles and red carpet lies, Nicholson always prized authenticity, and those who failed that test were exiled from his inner circle forever. Now, for the first time, Jack's inner circle is revealing the 6 actors he hated the most, and the chilling reasons why. In A Few Good Men, Jack Nicholson delivered one of the most quoted lines in cinema history. "You can't handle the truth." It was thunderous, iconic, and it overshadowed everyone else in the room, including Tom Cruise, who was meant to be the star. But behind the camera, the tension between Nicholson and Cruise was anything but theatrical. From the beginning, Jack viewed Cruise with a wary eye, not because he feared being outshone, but because he saw something he couldn't stand. A perfectly packaged movie star, all polish and precision, with none of the raw edge Nicholson respected. Jack came from a generation where acting was messy, lived in, where you bled on screen. He saw himself as a vessel of truth, someone who tore through scripts with instinct and fire. Cruise, in contrast, represented the new Hollywood, clean, charming, image-controlled. And to Jack, that wasn't acting, it was marketing. On set, their interactions were civil but cold. Nicholson, ever the professional, hit his marks and delivered his lines with trademark intensity. But according to insiders, he rarely spoke to Cruise off camera. When he did, it was brief, measured, and almost always laced with a quiet condescension. Crew members noticed the body language, how Jack would keep his distance, how he never once praised Cruise's performance, and how he quietly exited the set the moment his scenes were done. To those close to Nicholson, it became clear. Jack didn't respect Tom, not his style, not his process, not his fame. The tension escalated after filming wrapped. As Cruise began the press tour, the studio leaned heavily into his star power, putting his face on posters and talk shows while pushing Jack into the background, even though his performance was the film's emotional apex. That slight, subtle as it was, burned. Nicholson believed in hierarchy, in seniority, and in the idea that reverence should be earned and reciprocated. But what he saw in Cruise was a media darling who coasted on charisma, not depth. "The kid's got moves," Jack reportedly said at one party, "but he hasn't felt anything real yet." It wasn't just a critique of Cruise's acting, it was a dismissal of him as a person. Jack's inner circle knew that once he made up his mind about someone, there was no turning back. Though Cruise reportedly admired Nicholson, even idolized him, Jack was unmoved. He didn't want to be idolized. He wanted to be understood, and Cruise, for all his grinning, handshaking charm, never made that connection. Over time, their paths diverged completely. Jack refused offers to appear in Cruise-led productions and never publicly mentioned him again. Cruise, for his part, stopped referencing Jack in interviews, almost as if the wound was too raw, the rejection too personal. What's most tragic about their silent feud is what could have been. Two titans from different eras brought together for a moment of cinematic magic, only to walk away with bitterness lingering behind the applause. In the end, Cruise got the headlines, but Jack got the truth, and for Nicholson, that was all that ever mattered. In Hollywood, egos are currency, and few actors carried a bigger one in the 1990s than Val Kilmer. By the time Batman Forever hit theaters in 1995, Kilmer was seen as the new face of brooding cool. But behind the scenes, directors and co-stars whispered about his volatility, his perfectionism, and his complete unwillingness to be told what to do. And Jack Nicholson, he saw right through it. Though the two never shared a full film together, their paths crossed several times, at events, in negotiations, and most notably during the early development of Batman. Nicholson, who had played the Joker to critical acclaim in Tim Burton's 1989 Batman, felt a deep, almost paternal connection to the franchise. So when Kilmer was cast as Bruce Wayne, Jack took notice, and not in a good way. According to sources close to Jack, he felt Kilmer brought zero weight to the role, trading depth and grit for vanity and poses. While Jack's Joker was all madness and metaphor, Kilmer's Batman was, in Jack's words, just a guy in a suit. But it wasn't just professional disappointment, it was personal aversion. Kilmer's behavior on other sets, especially The Island of Dr. Moreau, where he notoriously clashed with Marlon Brando and got into screaming matches with crew members, reached Jack's ears. And Jack, who revered Brando like a spiritual father, reportedly took that insult personally. He told a colleague during a dinner in the late 90s, "You don't disrespect the old gods, especially when you've done nothing to earn the right." Nicholson saw Kilmer as arrogant, lacking humility and, worst of all, ungrateful. Jack believed that actors, no matter how famous, should pay their dues and show respect to those who paved the way. Kilmer, in his eyes, had skipped that step entirely, floating on good looks and attitude instead of experience and wisdom. If you're enjoying this behind-the-scenes look into Jack Nicholson's untold truths, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the real stories behind Hollywood's biggest legends. And tell us in the comments, did Val Kilmer's Batman ever live up to Jack's Joker in your eyes? Back to the story. Kilmer, for his part, never openly addressed Nicholson's dislike, but he reportedly sensed it. During an industry roundtable in the early 2000s, Kilmer avoided praising Nicholson when others were sharing their admiration. It was subtle but intentional. Hollywood may be full of fake smiles, but actors can feel when they're being watched or judged. Jack, now far removed from the grind of the industry, once confided to a friend that Kilmer represented everything wrong with the next generation of actors, all ego, no soul. In that single sentence was a lifetime of conviction. For Nicholson, acting wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a psychological war, a spiritual confession. To see it treated like a performance for flashbulbs and fashion magazines wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. And Val Kilmer, in his prime, was a walking symbol of that change. While the two men never had an explosive confrontation, they never needed one. Nicholson's disapproval was quiet, calculated, and unmistakable. He shut doors. He declined calls. And in casting meetings or informal producer chats, he made it clear, if Kilmer was involved, he wasn't. In a world driven by fame and profit, Nicholson always chose principle over politeness. And for Val Kilmer, that meant exile from Jack's carefully guarded circle of respect. No second chances, no redemption arc. Just a cold, lingering judgment that lasted long after the camera stopped rolling. Among the few actors Jack Nicholson ever publicly admired, Sean Penn once stood tall. Early in Penn's career, Jack saw something raw and real in him, a storm of rage, vulnerability, and defiance that reminded him of Brando in his prime. They shared dinners, mutual friends, and even political views. Jack supported Penn's early work, calling him one of the real ones in interviews. But in Hollywood, admiration can turn to bitterness in a heartbeat. Somewhere along the way, the mentor and the protege became strangers. Their divide didn't erupt in a tabloid headline or public screaming match. It unraveled slowly, quietly, through years of watching from afar. Jack, now older and more reflective, reportedly told close friends that Sean had lost the plot, not as an actor, but as a man consumed by chaos. What started as respect turned to revulsion as Penn's temper, activism, and erratic choices began drawing more attention than his performances. The breaking point came, insiders say, during a heated private encounter at a Hollywood fundraiser in the early 2000s. Nicholson, never one to shy away from politics, believed in passion, but he believed more in restraint. That night, Penn, reportedly drunk and loud, began berating another guest over the Iraq War. Jack tried to de-escalate, pulling Penn aside and whispering, "There's a way to fight without turning the table over." But Penn, ever the firebrand, lashed back, accusing Jack of going soft in his old age. It was the kind of disrespect Nicholson never forgot. The relationship soured instantly. Penn, in Jack's eyes, had become intoxicated not just with drink, but with his own sense of self-importance. The man who once made Jack proud was now a cautionary tale, someone who mistook outrage for insight, volume for truth. Worse still was Penn's behind-the-scenes behavior. Stories began surfacing of volatile set dynamics, abrupt walkouts, and open contempt for directors. Jack, who had his share of wild years, believed in controlled chaos, fire that served the art, not the ego. But Penn's version of rebellion by the 2010s had turned into something destructive. Friends say Nicholson quietly pulled out of a film project once he heard Penn's name attached. "I won't work with a man who can't tell when he's the problem," he allegedly told a longtime producer. It wasn't personal anymore. It was protective. Jack had spent his life cultivating a legacy of disciplined madness, a career built on knowing when to roar and when to retreat. Penn, by contrast, had become all roar, no retreat. To Nicholson, that wasn't just exhausting, it was tragic. Perhaps the deepest sting came when Penn, in a later interview, dismissed older actors clinging to old Hollywood traditions as irrelevant. He never named Jack, but those close to Nicholson said he felt it. Whether intentional or not, the comment cut deep. Jack had given Penn more than his time. He had given him belief. And in return, he felt mocked. Their paths never crossed again. No more phone calls. No mentions in interviews. Not even a nod of respect when their names inevitably came up in the same conversations. Nicholson, who forgave many things in his lifetime, infidelity, addiction, failure, never seemed to forgive betrayal. And in Penn, he saw something worse than an enemy. He saw a reflection of what he might have become if he'd lost control. The genius was still there, yes, but it was buried beneath rage, ego, and noise. And Jack Nicholson, the king of restraint wrapped in chaos, hated that more than anything. By the time Jack Nicholson first crossed paths with Leonardo DiCaprio, he was already stepping away from the spotlight. But he was still Jack, watching, reading, listening. And when the two finally appeared together in Martin Scorsese's The Departed in 2006, the idea seemed perfect, the old guard and the new, colliding in a crime epic that would cement both of their legacies. And on screen it worked. Nicholson was wild, unpredictable, and electric as Frank Costello, while DiCaprio simmered with desperation and grit. But off-screen, things weren't nearly as harmonious. According to crew members and close friends, Jack found Leo hollow. Not untalented, not even dislikable, just shallow. For Nicholson, who spent his career diving into characters with reckless emotional honesty, Leo's method felt rehearsed, even mechanical. "He's all calculation," Jack reportedly said after filming, "like a watch that keeps perfect time but never tells you anything about the weather." Their differences were stark. Jack was chaos in a tailored suit, improvising lines, challenging directors, adding unfiltered energy to every frame. Leo was prepared, precise, and intensely controlled. The infamous scene in The Departed where Jack pulls out a gun that wasn't in the script, DiCaprio flinched for real, and Scorsese kept the take. To many, it was a brilliant moment of spontaneity, but to Jack it was a test, one that Leo failed. After the film, they never worked together again. Nicholson reportedly turned down a follow-up project involving DiCaprio and walked away from several potential roles that would have placed them side by side again. Why? Because for all of Leo's critical acclaim and box office power, Jack saw through the curtain. He didn't hate DiCaprio the person, but he hated what he represented, the future of Hollywood without chaos. A generation of actors taught to protect their image, follow PR strategy, and keep their emotions behind a wall of technique. That was everything Jack fought against his entire career. It wasn't just Leo, of course. Nicholson had a growing discomfort with modern actors across the board. Too polished, too guarded, too unwilling to risk real failure in their performances. But DiCaprio, who had become the new symbol of prestige acting, took the brunt of Jack's scorn. Even in private conversations, Jack would dismiss him with a smirk. "He's too busy trying to be great," he once told a fellow actor. The great ones never tried. They just were. To outsiders, this may have sounded bitter, but those who knew Jack best say it wasn't envy. It was heartbreak. Watching Leo rise was a reminder that the Hollywood Jack had built his legend in, raw, loose, dangerous, was fading. And Leo, whether he meant to or not, was the face of that change. Still, there's irony in the fact that Leo deeply admired Jack. He spoke of him with reverence in interviews, calling their time on The Departed unforgettable. He even tried to mimic Jack's improvisational fearlessness in his later roles. But that reverence was never returned. Jack had a rule. Admiration didn't earn you access. Only authenticity did. And in DiCaprio, he saw a great actor with a missing center. Someone who knew every note of the song but never lived the lyrics. So as Nicholson entered his quiet years, retreating from the screen and the spotlight, he carried with him a list. Not a list of failures or regrets, but of men he couldn't sit beside. Not because they weren't famous, not because they weren't talented, but because they didn't understand the cost of truth. And for Jack Nicholson, the 6 actors he hated most, Tom Cruise, Val Kilmer, Sean Penn, Leonardo DiCaprio, and the unnamed few he never exposed, weren't just rivals. They were reminders that even in a town built on illusion, Jack still believed in something real. And when he couldn't find it, he walked away.